A Yellowstone report from 2012 was never filed. The smell was the first thing that confirmed something was terribly wrong in the clearing, a heavy scent of scorched copper and sulfur that hung unnaturally still in the cold mountain air. Elias, a seasoned backcountry ranger, stood at the edge of the tree line and stared at what remained of the Geological Survey camp. The campsite was located deep within the Thoroughfare region of Yellowstone, a massive expanse of wilderness widely considered the most remote area in the lower 48 states. It was late October of 2012, and the three-person survey team was officially 4 days overdue. Elias had hiked for 2 days through dense pine forests and over jagged ridges to reach their last known coordinates. He had expected to find a twisted ankle, a broken radio, or perhaps a group of researchers simply running behind schedule. Instead, he found absolute silence and a scene that defied all logic. The large dome tent sat in the center of the clearing, but it had not been collapsed by wind or torn by a grizzly bear. The bright orange nylon was entirely melted, fused together into a hard, glossy shell that reflected the gray afternoon light. The damage did not look like the result of a campfire gone out of control. There was no ash, no charred wood, and the dry yellow grass surrounding the tent was perfectly untouched. It looked as though an intense, localized heat source had baked the tent from the inside out, causing the synthetic material to shrink and petrify around the aluminum poles. The poles themselves were warped inward, bent as if subjected to immense and sudden atmospheric pressure. Elias did not call out. The profound quiet of the forest seemed to press against his ears, and an instinct older than his training told him to remain completely silent. He approached the petrified structure slowly, his boots crunching lightly on the frost-hardened dirt. He unholstered his bear spray, though he already knew that no animal was responsible for this. Peering through a melted gap in the nylon, he saw the 3 sleeping bags. They were empty, but they were compressed, flattened against the floor of the tent as if smoothed down by a heavy weight. There were no backpacks, no boots, and no sign of the expensive thermal imaging equipment the team had brought with them. The only item left behind was a small green field journal lying in the dirt near the fire ring. Elias picked it up. The cover was warm to the touch, despite the ambient temperature hovering near 30 degrees. He opened the journal. The first dozen pages were filled with standard scientific notations, neatly written columns detailing soil acidity, water temperatures, and seismic readings from the nearby thermal vents. But as he turned the pages, the handwriting began to deteriorate. The neat columns gave way to sprawling, erratic sentences that pushed off the edges of the paper. The entries from 3 days prior stopped mentioning geology entirely. Instead, the lead researcher had written repeatedly about a low, vibrating hum that seemed to emanate not from the ground, but from the empty spaces between the trees. The final entry, written in a frantic, pressing hand, consisted of only one sentence. It read, "The shadows are unlatching from the pines, and they do not cast themselves on the ground." Elias felt a cold prickle of sweat form at the base of his neck. He reached for his shoulder radio, keying the microphone to contact the dispatch center at Mammoth Hot Springs. He spoke softly, identifying himself and requesting an immediate emergency channel. He waited for the familiar burst of static and the dispatcher's voice. Instead, the radio emitted a sound he had never heard before. It was a wet, rhythmic tearing noise, followed by a slow, dragging exhalation that sounded impossibly close. It did not sound like signal interference. It sounded like something breathing directly into a microphone in a hollow, echoing room. Elias released the button, his heart hammering against his ribs. He tried again. The same slow, ragged breath answered him, but this time he could hear a faint clicking noise in the background, like teeth snapping together in the dark. He turned the radio off completely. The air in the clearing felt suddenly heavy, as if the barometric pressure had plummeted in a matter of seconds. The sky above the canopy shifted from a pale, overcast gray to a bruised, unnatural purple. A light snow began to fall, but as a flake landed on the sleeve of his green uniform, Elias realized it was not snow. It was fine, pale ash. There were no active forest fires anywhere in the region, and the nearest thermal geyser capable of producing such debris was over 20 miles away. The ash fell silently, coating the melted tent and the silent clearing in a thin layer of gray dust. Elias knew he had to leave. He had a patrol cabin waiting for him about 4 miles south, a sturdy log structure with heavy iron locks and a wood stove. He placed the journal into his waterproof pouch, turned his back on the campsite, and began to walk. The hike to the cabin took 2 hours, and the entire way, Elias could not shake the feeling of being paced. He heard no twigs snap, no heavy footsteps in the underbrush, but the woods were entirely devoid of wildlife. Not a single squirrel chattered, and no birds called from the high branches. The silence was oppressive, heavy enough to make his ears ring. Every time he stopped to check his compass, he felt a strange, cold pressure on the back of his neck, the distinct sensation of being observed by something that understood exactly what he was doing. When the small, dark shape of the Thorofar patrol cabin finally appeared through the trees, Elias felt a wave of relief so intense it made his knees weak. He unlocked the heavy wooden door, stepped inside, and immediately threw the deadbolt. He pulled the thick iron shutters across the 2 small windows, plunging the single-room cabin into darkness. He used his flashlight to find the woodpile in the corner and quickly built a fire in the cast-iron stove. The fire caught, but the flames burned with a strange pale blue hue, casting long, twisting shadows against the log walls. Elias sat in the only chair, his radio turned off, the heavy quiet of the cabin wrapping around him. He ate a cold ration bar and tried to rationalize what he had seen. A freak lightning strike, anomalous geothermal activity, a collective psychological break among the survey team. He repeated these theories to himself, trying to build a wall of logic against the creeping dread in his stomach. Night fell completely. The temperature outside plummeted to the single digits, and the logs of the cabin began to groan and pop in the extreme cold. It was near midnight when the silence was finally broken. The radio, which Elias had securely clipped to his tactical vest and powered down hours ago, suddenly crackled to life on its own. The green indicator light flickered in the dim room. A voice began to speak through the speaker. It was not the dispatcher. It was Elias's own voice, recorded from his earlier attempt to call for help. He heard himself say, "Yellowstone Dispatch, this is Thorofar Patrol." But the audio was distorted. It was slowed down, dragged out into a deep, guttural drawl, and underneath his own words, he could hear that same wet, rhythmic breathing. The playback looped 3 times, growing slightly louder with each repetition before cutting off into dead silence. Elias did not move. He sat frozen in the chair, his eyes locked on the radio. Then, a sound came from outside. It was not the wind. It was a soft, heavy thud against the exterior wall of the cabin, about 10 feet away from the door. It sounded like a wet sack of flour being dropped against the wood. A few seconds later, another thud hit the wall, this one higher up, near the roofline. Then came a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a scratching noise, slow and deliberate, dragging along the logs toward the shuttered window. It did not sound like claws. It sounded like bare, rigid fingers scraping against the timber. Driven by a terrifying compulsion he could not explain, Elias stood up and walked silently to the window. His hand trembled as he gripped the iron latch of the shutter. He opened it just a fraction of an inch, creating a tiny slit to peer out into the clearing. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, but the pale ash covering the ground provided a faint, ghostly illumination. Standing at the edge of the tree line, about 50 yards away, were 3 figures. They were wearing the bright yellow and gray winter parkas of the missing geological team. But they were not acting like lost hikers. They were standing perfectly still, shoulder to shoulder, facing away from the cabin. Their heads were tilted back at an extreme, impossible angle, staring straight up into the pitch-black sky. They did not shiver in the freezing wind. They did not move a single muscle. Elias watched them for what felt like hours, unable to look away, until the pale light of dawn finally began to bleed over the horizon. When the sun broke through the clouds, the figures were gone. Elias waited until mid-morning before unbarring the door. He stepped outside, his rifle gripped tightly in his hands. He walked to the edge of the tree line where the figures had stood. The layer of frost and pale ash was completely undisturbed. There were no footprints leading into the clearing, and none leading away. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist when the light touched them. Elias packed his gear, locked the cabin, and began the brutal 30-mile hike back to civilization. He did not stop to rest, and he did not turn on his radio again. 2 days later, Elias sat in a brightly lit, windowless office at the park headquarters in Mammoth Hot Springs. He sat across from his sector supervisor, a stern man who listened quietly as Elias recounted every detail of the melted tent, the ash, the journal, and the figures in the dark. When Elias finished, he placed the small green journal on the desk. The supervisor stared at it for a long time, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a manila folder. The supervisor pushed the folder across the desk. He spoke in a flat, bureaucratic tone, stating that the geological survey team had emerged safely from the south entrance of the park 3 days prior. They had reported a minor equipment failure and decided to cut their expedition short. Elias opened the folder. Inside was a checkout log from the south entrance gate. It listed 3 names, complete with signatures and vehicle plate numbers. But as Elias read the names, a cold knot formed in his chest. The names on the checkout sheet did not match the names of the researchers he had been sent to find. He looked up at his supervisor, pointing out the discrepancy. The supervisor simply picked up the green journal, placed it into a heavy gray lockbox behind his desk, and told Elias that altitude sickness and isolation often cause severe auditory and visual hallucinations. He advised Elias to take a mandatory 2 weeks of paid leave, heavily implying that any further discussion of the incident would result in a permanent psychological discharge. Elias took the leave and shortly after requested a transfer to a different park entirely. He never returned to the thoroughfare. His detailed handwritten report was never entered into the digital database. If you search the public records for a missing geological team in the fall of 2012, you will find absolutely nothing. But among the veteran backcountry rangers of Yellowstone, a quiet rumor still circulates. They say that if you find yourself near the thermal vents of the deep thoroughfare late in the season and the temperature suddenly drops, you should never look out the windows of the patrol cabins. They say that sometimes, when the sky turns purple and the ash falls, you can still hear the static on the emergency channels playing back a slowed, distorted voice, accompanied by the sound of wet, rhythmic breathing. A Yorkshire moor incident where voices knew their names. The voice did not sound like the wind scraping through the dense, dying heather, though the high moors were famous for playing cruel tricks on isolated travelers. It sounded perfectly human, cutting cleanly through the thick, freezing fog that had settled over the valley, and it was calmly asking for a man named Thomas. It did not use his given name, however. It used a very specific, childish nickname that had not been spoken aloud by anyone in more than 30 years. Thomas and his younger brother, Samuel, stopped walking immediately, the heavy crunch of their hiking boots fading into the sudden, suffocating quiet of the moorland. They were at least 12 miles from the nearest paved road, deep within a notoriously desolate stretch of the Yorkshire landscape. It was late October, 1998, and the temperature had been dropping steadily since noon. The 2 men were experienced hikers who had planned a 3-day trek across the elevated peat bogs, carrying heavy packs and relying on a compass to navigate the featureless terrain. The moors possessed a bleak, ancient quality characterized by rolling hills of dark peat, hidden sinkholes, and miles of unbroken, rusted heather. The fog had rolled in around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, dropping a curtain of white over the landscape and reducing their visibility to less than 40 feet. They had been navigating in total, focused silence when the voice first called out. Samuel turned slowly toward his brother, his breath forming pale, ragged clouds in the damp air. Neither man spoke at first. They simply stood on the narrow, rocky sheep path, straining their ears against the vast emptiness around them. According to the police report filed days later, the brothers initially tried to rationalize the terrifying sound. They thought it might have been another hiker lost in these severe whiteout conditions, someone who had coincidentally called out a similar sounding word distorted by the dense moisture in the air. They waited for a cry for help, or the sound of footsteps on the gravel. Instead, the voice spoke again, drifting smoothly through the gray mist from their left. This time, the words were absolutely unmistakable. The unseen woman asked why Thomas had broken the small porcelain bird on the windowsill of their old house, detailing a very specific, quiet incident from their childhood in 1974 that only the two brothers knew about. The tone was completely conversational, devoid of panic, effort, or cold. It sounded exactly as though the speaker were sitting comfortably in a warm living room just beyond the opaque wall of fog. Samuel felt a cold, leaden dread settle deep in his chest. He noted later to investigators that the voice possessed the exact cadence, the precise pauses, and the soft northern lilt of their mother, who had passed away 7 years prior. Panic began to take root in their minds, but basic survival instincts kept them anchored to the present reality. Thomas gestured sharply for Samuel to keep moving forward, completely abandoning the sudden, irrational urge to call back to the mist. They adjusted the straps of their heavy packs and picked up their pace, their boots slipping against the damp earth and the slick, exposed roots of the vegetation. The mist seemed to thicken with every 100 yards they covered, wrapping around them like a wet, heavy blanket that muffled all ambient noise. The profound silence of the moors returned, broken only by the frantic, uneven rhythm of their own breathing and the dull thud of their footsteps against the peat. For nearly an hour, they hiked in a grueling, terrified silence, checking the magnetic compass repeatedly to ensure they were still heading south toward their designated waypoint. The landscape offered no landmarks, only endless waves of gray and brown fading into the fog. The ambient light began to fail rapidly as the late afternoon gave way to early evening. Around 5:30 p.m., the pale gray fog darkened into an inky, bruising purple. It was then that they stumbled upon something lying directly in the center of their narrow, muddy path. It was a single, heavy leather hiking glove. Thomas crouched down and picked it up with trembling hands. The leather was completely dry, entirely untouched by the pervasive moorland dampness that had soaked everything else in the environment. More disturbing, however, was the stark realization that it was Thomas's own spare glove. It was a distinctive brand bearing a small, frayed scuff mark on the thumb that he instantly recognized. He had securely packed that exact glove at the very bottom of his rucksack early that morning beneath his sleeping bag and extra clothing. He immediately unbuckled his pack and tore through his meticulously organized belongings. The contents of his bag were undisturbed, but the spare left glove was entirely missing from its sealed, waterproof pouch. Neither man had taken off their packs since noon. The sheer impossibility of the object lying on the trail ahead of them paralyzed them both. As they stood, staring at the leather glove in the fading light, the absolute stillness of the twilight was shattered once again. The voices returned, but there were significantly more of them now. It was no longer just the comforting, familiar sound of their deceased mother. From the deep, featureless shadows to their right came the voice of Samuel's former employer, a man who had moved away a decade earlier, casually discussing the details of a mundane financial spreadsheet. From directly behind them, they heard the distinct, sharp, unmistakable laugh of Thomas's wife. The sounds did not echo across the open landscape. They were flat, incredibly intimate, and projected from various unseen points in the darkness, circling the two men at a radius of what sounded like 50 feet. The brothers abandoned their carefully planned route and began to scramble blindly up a steep, rocky incline, desperately hoping to find higher ground and perhaps escape the dense layer of fog that seemed to be trapping the sounds. The temperature plummeted to near freezing, the cold biting at their exposed faces and hands. The voices did not pursue them aggressively, nor did they raise their volume to shout. They simply kept pace, effortlessly maintaining that invisible 50-foot perimeter no matter how fast the men climbed. As the men exhausted themselves on the steep incline, the casual conversations filtering through the dark began to shift in a deeply sinister way. The unseen entities in the fog stopped reciting old memories and distant conversations. Instead, they began calmly narrating the men's exact present actions. A voice that sounded exactly like Thomas called out from the dark, stating flatly that Samuel was slipping on the wet grass. A fraction of a second later, Samuel lost his footing on a slick patch of moss and fell hard to his knees, scraping his hands raw on the abrasive rock. A voice mimicking Samuel then whispered from the left side of the trail, noting in a clinical tone that Thomas was looking at his compass, but the needle was no longer moving. Thomas stared down at his trembling hand in absolute horror. The red magnetic needle of his compass was frozen perfectly in place, pointing uselessly toward the plastic side casing, completely unresponsive to his frantic twisting and turning. The natural laws of their environment were slowly unraveling, replaced by the impossible logic of the voices in the dark. They had no navigation, no visibility, and no way to outrun the sounds that knew their every move. By 8 o'clock at night, the darkness on the moors was absolute. The fog had merged with the black of the sky, creating a sensory void. Exhausted, freezing, and entirely lost, they managed to set up their small two-person emergency pop-up tent on a relatively flat patch of soft peat. They zipped themselves inside with only a single, dim, battery-powered flashlight illuminating the thin orange fabric of their shelter. They huddled together in the center of the cramped space, clutching their heavy waterproof coats around themselves, shaking from the profound physical cold and the unnatural terror of their situation. Outside the thin nylon walls, the moorland remained dead quiet for a long, agonizingly slow hour. The wind completely died down, leaving an oppressive stillness that pressed against their ears. Then, just after 9:15 p.m., the soft, wet sound of bare feet stepping through the thick mud began to slowly circle the tent. The squelching footsteps were deliberate, unhurried, and impossibly heavy, as if the person walking bore an immense crushing weight. The footsteps stopped directly outside the fabric wall, mere inches from where Thomas sat, with his spine pressed rigidly against the fragile material. The brothers held their breath, their lungs burning, squeezing their eyes shut against the dim light. A voice spoke from the other side of the nylon. It was Thomas's own voice, but it sounded entirely hollow, drained of all warmth, emotion, and humanity. It leaned close to the fabric and whispered a secret that Thomas had never told anyone, not even his brother. It was a dark, deeply personal regret from his early 20s, involving a severe, unreported hit-and-run accident on Interstate 90. It spoke the horrible words slowly, savoring the syllables, while something smooth, cold, and heavy dragged lightly against the outside of the tent fabric, sliding down the nylon with a sickening hiss. Samuel squeezed his eyes even tighter, pressing his cold hands over his ears with all his strength, but the voice seemed to bypass his hearing entirely, resonating perfectly and clearly deep within his own skull. He tucked his head between his knees, unable to look at his brother's face, paralyzed by a primitive, overwhelming dread. He remained in that curled, defensive posture, praying silently for the morning sun. According to the official timeline constructed by the authorities, Samuel stayed perfectly still, refusing to open his eyes or lower his hands until the pale, gray light of dawn finally began to filter through the orange fabric of the tent. When he finally found the courage to look up, the harsh reality of the morning offered no comfort. He was completely alone in the small space. The zipper of the tent was still fully closed from the inside, the metal teeth perfectly aligned and undisturbed. Yet, Thomas was entirely gone. He had left behind his heavy leather hiking boots, his insulated winter coat, and his fully packed rucksack. There was no tear in the fabric, no sign of a struggle, and no logical way a grown man could have exited the shelter without unzipping the door. A massive search and rescue operation was launched across the moors later that afternoon, initiated only after Samuel managed to hike down to a small, isolated farming village and dial 999 from a public telephone. Over 40 trained volunteers, tracking dogs, and local authorities combed the desolate landscape for 6 exhaustive days. They found absolutely no trace of Thomas. The tracking dogs refused to approach the campsite, whining and pulling against their leashes. There were no footprints leading away from the tent in the soft mud, no discarded clothing on the moors, and no clues to suggest where he might have gone in the freezing night without his boots or coat. The police eventually suspended the search, filing a formal report that dismissed Samuel's account of the voices as severe psychological trauma. They officially concluded that he had suffered from acute auditory hallucinations induced by extreme hypothermia, physical stress, and isolation. The case was quietly closed, categorized as a tragic wilderness disappearance, the kind that happens occasionally when arrogant hikers underestimate the brutal nature of the high bogs. But the locals who lived on the edge of the vast emptiness knew better than to trust the official police narrative. Months after the search was officially suspended, strange, quiet reports began to surface among the isolated farming communities bordering the moors. Shepherds rounding up stray flocks in the dense evening fog would occasionally hear a lone man's voice drifting across the empty expanse of heather. The voice was always incredibly calm, always perfectly conversational, and it always called the solitary shepherds by their full legal names. It would quietly ask them about their private grievances, their hidden debts, or their quietest sins, speaking from the impenetrable mist just beyond their sight. The legend of the conversational voices on the high moors remains a deeply unsettling local secret, a permanent scar on the landscape, and a quiet warning to those who think the empty places of the world are truly silent. An Alaska bush pilot reported something following his aircraft. The unnatural drop in cabin temperature happens first, followed almost immediately by the compass needle drifting lazily away from true north. The pilot, a man named Arthur, is entirely alone above the vast, empty expanse of the Yukon-Koyukuk region. It is 11:40 p.m. on a moonless Tuesday in late November. The glass of the windshield is coated in a creeping layer of frost. But what catches his attention is not the ice, it is the solid black shape moving steadily just off his right wing. It is darker than the night sky, a massive void blocking out the distant, cold stars. Arthur has flown these northern routes for 14 years. He knows the unforgiving airspace like the back of his hand. He is flying a standard, unglamorous cargo run, carrying mail, heavy machinery parts, and medical supplies from a small, isolated outpost back toward the airfield in Fairbanks. The flight is normally a quiet, meditative stretch of time, marked only by the steady, rhythmic drone of the single engine and the faint red glow of the instrument panel illuminating his tired face. Below him, the landscape is a frozen, jagged wasteland, heavily forested and entirely devoid of human life. There are no roads down there, no cabins, no emergency landing strips. There is just an endless ocean of deep snow and ancient pine where the temperature sits at 40 degrees below zero. He reaches forward to adjust the frequency on his aviation radio. He depresses the button on the worn control yoke to hail the regional flight service station, intending to ask if there is any other logged traffic in his sector. When he speaks into the headset, the only response is a thick, wet static. It does not sound like typical atmospheric interference or a lost signal. It sounds heavy and deliberate, almost rhythmic, like the slow, mechanical breathing of something massive resting at the bottom of a deep well. He tries a different frequency, twisting the dial to the universal emergency channel. The bizarre static follows him. It is perfectly uniform across every band. The shape on his right begins to shift. It does not bank or turn the way a conventional aircraft should. It simply slides laterally through the air, maintaining a perfect, unnatural parallel to his wing. Arthur reduces his speed, pulling the throttle back slightly to let the strange object pass him by. The needle on his airspeed indicator drops to 100 knots. The massive shadow slows with him. It matches his deceleration instantly without any visible thrust, exhaust, or momentum correction. The engine of his small plane struggles against the freezing thin air, but from the void outside, there is absolute, terrifying silence. A cold sweat breaks out on the back of his neck, chilling him despite his heavy winter gear. According to aviation reports and local legends, pilots in the far north occasionally see strange things over the ice. They see ice crystals reflecting moonlight, classified military test flights out of distant bases, or the aurora borealis playing tricks on tired eyes. But there is no moonlight tonight, and no military aircraft flies without strobe lights while hugging the side of a civilian plane in the dead of winter. Arthur pushes the yoke forward, descending 500 feet in a sudden, evasive maneuver. His stomach drops with the sudden loss of altitude. He levels out at 5,500 feet. He looks out the frost-covered right window. The black mass is still there, filling the space exactly as it had before, perfectly matching his dive. The temperature inside the tiny cockpit continues to plummet rapidly. The small cabin heater, which had been working perfectly for the first 2 hours of the flight, now blows freezing air that bites at his exposed cheeks. Ice begins to creep rapidly across the inside of the windows, forming complex, jagged patterns that distort his view of the outside world. He reaches out with a thick, gloved hand to wipe the frost away from the side window. As his hand nears the glass, the hairs on his arm stand straight up. A heavy, crackling, static charge fills the small cabin, making the air taste like copper and ozone. The analog dials on his instrument panel begin to twitch violently. The altimeter spins out of control, registering an impossible climb to 10,000 feet, then a sudden dive to zero, over and over again. Up until now, the object has been nothing more than a silhouette, a hole in the sky. But as the dark shape drifts slightly forward, pacing the nose of his plane, Arthur notices a faint, unnatural illumination along its lower edge. It is a dull, sickly yellow glow, the color of old, rotting parchment. The light does not cast beams into the dark sky. It seems to be absorbed by the dark metal or whatever unknown material the craft is made of. The glow pulses slowly, swelling and fading to the exact rhythm of the heavy, wet static still broadcasting in his headset. With each pulse of the yellow light, the engine of his small plane coughs, the revolutions per minute dropping dangerously low before recovering. Panic begins to take root in his chest, cold and sharp. If the engine dies over this remote stretch of mountains in the middle of winter, there is absolutely no chance of survival. There is nowhere to glide, nowhere to land, and even if he somehow manages to bring the plane down into a snowbank without tearing it apart, these sub-zero temperatures will freeze him solid before morning. He frantically taps the fuel gauge with his knuckle, making sure the line is not freezing solid. The tank is half full. He adjusts the fuel mixture, trying desperately to keep the struggling engine running smooth. But the mechanical components of his plane feel entirely secondary now. The object outside is dictating the reality of the airspace. The yellow light pulses again, much brighter this time. The engine sputters hard, a violent metallic shudder vibrating through the entire airframe. The massive object suddenly banks directly toward him. The sheer scale of it becomes terrifyingly clear in the darkness. It is not the size of another small cargo plane. It is the size of a large commercial airliner, perhaps even larger, but it has no wings. It is shaped like a massive, blunt cylinder, perfectly smooth and devoid of windows. It closes the distance between them in a fraction of a second, violating all known laws of inertia and aerodynamics. It is so close now that it blocks out the entire right hemisphere of the sky, its hull looming just feet from his wingtip. The dull yellow light shifts violently. It turns into a blinding, pale green luminescence that completely floods the cockpit. The pale light washes out the comforting red glow of his instruments. It casts long, unnatural, stretching shadows across the cabin. In that blinding green glare, the loud, steady sound of his own engine disappears completely. The silence that follows is absolute and crushing. For several agonizing seconds, Arthur is suspended in a soundless void, falling through the night sky in a dead metal tube bathed in sickly green light. He grabs the controls, pulling back with all his strength. The yoke goes completely stiff. It will not budge a single inch. The rudder pedals are locked firmly in place. He is no longer flying the aircraft. He is a helpless passenger in his own plane, trapped in a silent, invisible grip of unknown origin, plummeting quietly toward the jagged mountain peaks hidden in the dark below. He waits for the inevitable impact. He watches the broken altimeter dial, which is now completely frozen at 4,000 feet. The green light outside the window is so intense he can see the dark blue veins in the back of his own hands, sharp and clear against his pale skin. Then, as abruptly and inexplicably as it began, the green light extinguishes. The heavy, crushing pressure in the cabin vanishes in an instant. The control yoke jerks violently forward in his hands, nearly breaking his wrists. The deafening mechanical roar of the single engine returns, painfully loud after the profound, unnatural silence. The plane drops sharply, catching a turbulent updraft. Arthur fights the controls, desperately pulling the nose up just as the dark, jagged silhouette of a snow-covered mountain ridge scrapes past the underbelly of the aircraft. He clears the deadly peak by less than 200 feet. The plane rattles and shakes in the disturbed air, but the propeller is spinning. It is flying. He gasps for air, his lungs burning deeply as if he has been holding his breath underwater for minutes. He looks frantically out the right window. The sky is entirely empty. The distant stars have returned, cold and indifferent, scattered across the endless black canvas of the northern night. The heavy, breathing static in his headset is gone, replaced entirely by the normal, quiet hiss of an empty radio frequency. He does not reach out to touch the radio again. He flies the remaining 80 miles to the airfield in complete, paranoid silence, keeping his eyes fixed straight ahead through the frosted glass. Every dark cloud on the horizon looks like a massive, silent cylinder waiting to drop out of the sky and swallow him. He lands the plane at the empty airfield just after 1:30 a.m. The yellow runway lights seem unnaturally bright, burning his tired eyes. When he taxis the aircraft to his designated hangar and finally cuts the engine, he does not immediately unbuckle his harness. He sits alone in the freezing dark cockpit, his hands shaking violently on his lap, staring blankly at the frost slowly melting on the glass. When the sleepy ground crew finally approaches with flashlights to ask why he is just sitting there in the dark, Arthur unbuckles his belt and steps out onto the icy tarmac. His legs are weak, barely able to support his weight. He tells the mechanics to check the electrical system, claiming he suffered a temporary alternator failure over the mountains. He does not mention the massive shadow. He does not mention the dead silence or the blinding green light. The official maintenance report, filed by the crew 3 days later, notes absolutely no mechanical faults with the engine, the battery, or the alternator. The plane is thoroughly inspected and deemed perfectly safe for regular flight. However, the lead mechanic mentions a highly unusual anomaly in his handwritten notes at the bottom of the page. Along the entire right side of the aluminum fuselage, the standard white paint is heavily discolored. It is a pale, sickly yellow, as if the metal had been subjected to intense, localized heat or strange radiation. The scorch mark is massive, extending unbroken from the nose of the plane all the way to the tail, yet the metal itself is not warped or melted in any way. Arthur never flies that northern route again. He quietly requests a transfer to daytime cargo runs in the southern, more populated part of the state, avoiding the remote mountain passes entirely. Other veteran pilots occasionally ask him about the strange, yellow discoloration on the side of his old plane, which remains parked at the far edge of the frozen airfield. They ask if he flew through a strange chemical cloud or if weird atmospheric lightning struck the wing during a storm. He always gives a vague, dismissive answer and quickly changes the subject. But on cold, moonless winter nights, when the aviation radio in the dispatch office picks up a heavy, rhythmic static, the older pilots at the airfield fall perfectly silent. They step outside and look out toward the dark northern horizon, wondering what is drifting quietly through the freezing blackness, pacing the empty skies, waiting for the sound of a lonely engine. A Banff hiker was found days later with no memory of the trail. When the heavy beam of a commercial transport truck cut through the freezing fog along a desolate stretch of Highway 1, it was just past 3 in the morning. The driver had not seen another vehicle for over 40 miles. The surrounding forests of the Canadian Rockies were swallowed by absolute pitch black, pressing in tightly against the narrow ribbon of asphalt. As the truck rounded a sweeping curve, the headlights washed over a lone figure standing precariously close to the white shoulder line. The driver instinctively hit the brakes, the heavy tires hissing against the damp road. The figure was not waving for help. He was a man, standing perfectly rigid, facing the dense and impenetrable tree line rather than the highway. He was shivering violently in a heavy canvas winter coat that was easily 3 sizes too large for his frame. The truck driver, gripped by a sudden and inexplicable sense of dread, did not open his cabin door. Instead, he locked it, rolled his window down just a fraction of an inch, and called the authorities. When the provincial police arrived 20 minutes later, they recognized the shivering man almost immediately from a high-priority missing persons bulletin issued 4 days earlier. He was the experienced mountaineer who had vanished without a trace from a remote alpine trail in Banff National Park, over 130 miles away. But when the officers wrapped a thick blanket around his shoulders and gently asked for his name, the man simply stared through them. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and entirely hollow as he whispered that he was still in the woods. According to the official search and rescue logs, the 32-year-old man had embarked on a carefully planned 3-day solo trek near the rugged Sawback Range. He was not an amateur. He was a seasoned outdoorsman who carried a satellite emergency beacon, detailed topographical maps protected in waterproof casing, and enough high-calorie provisions to comfortably last a week. His detailed itinerary was filed with park rangers, outlining a precise route that followed well-worn valleys and challenging alpine passes. For the first 48 hours of his journey, everything appeared entirely normal. Then, without warning, his satellite beacon ceased transmitting. It did not send a distress signal. The digital ping simply vanished from the monitoring grid at exactly 11:15 p.m. When a specialized search and rescue team finally reached his last known coordinates 2 days later, the scene they discovered left them deeply unsettled. His isolated camp was perfectly intact. His heavy, weatherproof tent was securely pitched beneath a canopy of old-growth pines. His 0-degree sleeping bag was neatly unrolled, and a small, portable camp stove sat cold next to a carefully constructed fire pit. Most disturbing of all were his heavy, mud-caked hiking boots. They were sitting neatly side by side just inside the zippered tent flap. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no aggressive animal tracks, and no scattered gear to indicate panic. The undisturbed scene suggested a deeply unnatural narrative. It looked as though the man had calmly unzipped his tent in the middle of the freezing night, stood up in his thick woolen socks, and walked purposefully out into the sprawling, silent wilderness. Finding the missing hiker alive should have been a moment of profound relief for the rescue teams, but the physical condition in which he was discovered only caused the mystery to deepen into something much darker. The sheer distance between his abandoned campsite and the icy stretch of highway where he was found spanned roughly 130 miles of unforgiving terrain. It was a brutal landscape of jagged, unnamed peaks, deep ravines, and freezing, fast-moving rivers. It was a journey that would have taken a fully equipped, highly trained expedition team over a week to traverse on foot. Yet, the man had seemingly covered that impossible distance in under 4 days. More baffling and deeply disturbing were the bottoms of his feet. Despite leaving his protective boots at the campsite, his bare soles were entirely pristine. There were no deep lacerations from the sharp scree fields, no pine needles embedded in his skin, and no signs of severe frostbite from the freezing alpine temperatures. He had allegedly walked over 100 miles through the harsh Canadian wilderness without shoes, yet his feet looked as though he had been resting indoors. Furthermore, the oversized, stained winter coat he was found wearing bore a faded embroidered logo from a regional logging company. According to public records, that specific logging company had filed for bankruptcy and ceased all operations in 1998. The hiker possessed absolutely no memory of where he acquired the heavy coat, how he crossed the impassable mountain ranges, or why he had abandoned his own shelter. Medical professionals at the regional hospital noted that his physical vitals were bizarrely, almost impossibly stable. He was not suffering from severe dehydration, and his core body temperature and blood sugar levels were entirely within normal limits, heavily suggesting he had eaten and rested recently. But his mind was trapped behind a thick, impenetrable wall of fog. When attending physicians gently pushed him to recount any detail from the last 4 days, his resting heart rate would immediately spike to dangerous, erratic levels. He would squeeze his eyes shut, dig his fingernails into the rigid plastic edges of his hospital bed, and describe an overwhelming sensation of heavy pressure, comparing it to the feeling of being trapped at the lightless bottom of a deep lake. He told attending psychiatrists that the last normal event he could vividly remember was sitting by his unlit campfire around 8 o'clock in the evening, listening to the bitter wind move through the high pine branches. Then, according to his fractured, halting recollections, the wind completely died. He claimed that the natural ambient sounds of the forest, the chirping insects, the rustling underbrush, the distant rush of glacial water, all ceased at the exact same moment. In their place came a low, continuous, vibrating hum that seemed to echo from beneath the soil, a sound so deep it made his teeth ache and his vision blur. Hoping to construct a timeline of his movements, investigators retrieved the man's digital camera from the side pocket of his discarded backpack at the campsite. They transported the memory card to a lab, hoping the photographs might provide a rational explanation for his sudden disappearance. The first 30 pictures on the card were entirely unremarkable, showcasing sprawling, sunlit mountain vistas, gray rock faces, and clear blue skies typical of a Banff hiking trip. But the final series of images, captured on the night he vanished, defied any logical explanation. There were exactly 14 photographs taken in rapid, frantic succession at 2:14 in the morning. At first glance, the images were mostly pitch black, violently out of focus, and marred by strange, thick digital artifacts. But as photo analysts slowly adjusted the exposure and contrast levels in a darkened lab, vague, deeply unsettling shapes began to emerge from the digital noise. The massive pine trees in the background appeared heavily distorted, as if the thick wooden trunks were bending at impossible, unnatural angles toward the lens of the camera. In the final 3 photographs, the dense, suffocating canopy of pine needles overhead was faintly illuminated by an unnatural pale gray light that cast no shadows. The distinct, reflective outline of the hiker's tent was nowhere to be seen in any of the frames. Digital metadata extracted from the files indicated that these final photos were captured deep within a valley nearly 20 miles away from where the physical camera was actually found. The hiker remained in a secure psychiatric ward under close medical observation for over 2 weeks. During that extended period, his missing memories did not naturally return, but highly specific, disturbing behavioral tics began to surface. Night shift nurses reported in their charts that the man would wake from a dead sleep at exactly 2:14 in the morning every single night without fail. He would immediately pull his knees tightly to his chest, press the palms of his hands fiercely over his ears, and stare blankly at the acoustic ceiling tiles. When a night orderly once cautiously approached and asked him what was wrong, the man did not look away from the ceiling. He merely whispered that the trees outside the window were too quiet and that the sky behind the clouds was the wrong color. During his daily therapy sessions, he claimed that during his lost days, he had walked through a sprawling, ancient forest where the shadows cast by the trees did not match the position of the sun. He spoke in a monotone voice about a hidden valley that did not exist on any topographical map, a place where the jagged rocks felt strangely warm to the bare touch, and the stagnant air smelled heavily of ozone and burning copper. He adamantly insisted that he had not walked the 130 miles to the highway. Instead, he claimed the dark woods had simply shifted and rotated around him, rearranging their geography in an endless maze until they finally spat him out onto the cold asphalt. The most deeply unsettling revelation came during a routine cognitive mapping test in his third week of observation. A specialist asked the man to draw a simple map of his planned route on a large sheet of paper, hoping the physical, repetitive act of tracing his steps might unlock a suppressed memory fragment. The hiker calmly took the black pen and began to sketch the Sawback Range with surprising, practiced accuracy. He drew the winding trail, the river crossings, and the exact location of his final campsite. But as his pen reached the perimeter of the camp, his hand began to tremble violently. He drew a tight, jagged, aggressive circle around the campsite. He pressed the ballpoint pen down so hard that the thick paper tore, furiously filling the circle with dense, chaotic scribbles of black ink until the pen ran dry. When the specialist carefully asked him what the dark void represented, the man stopped drawing entirely. His breathing grew terribly shallow. He looked up, his eyes hollow, exhausted, and filled with a profound terror, and stated softly that it was the place where the geography finally ran out. He told her that on that night, he had walked a few yards into the trees to investigate a strange, metallic sound, but when he turned around to go back to the safety of his tent, the trail was simply gone. It was not hidden by brush or darkness, it was completely erased from the earth. He said he kept walking in a straight line for what felt like years, but the massive tree trunks merely repeated themselves, forming an endless, looping corridor of identical bark and dead silence, trapped beneath a flat sky that held absolutely no stars. To this day, the bizarre case remains officially classified by the authorities as a severe incident of temporary dissociative amnesia, likely brought on by exposure to the elements or an acute psychological break. The investigative file was quietly closed, with officials concluding that the man must have somehow hitched a ride on a private logging road to cover the impossible physical distance, despite the glaring fact that no driver ever came forward and his feet bore no signs of travel. The hiker never returned to the Canadian Rockies. According to distant relatives, he relocated to a flat, arid desert region in the American Southwest, choosing a home miles away from any large trees or heavy foliage. But the veteran park rangers who patrol the deep, isolated valleys of Banff still whisper about the abandoned campsite near the Sawback Range. They say that on certain still, moonless nights, the natural, comforting sounds of the alpine woods simply drop away without warning, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating, and unnatural silence. And those who intimately know the persistent legend of the lost hiker know better than to step off the marked trail in the dark, driven by a quiet, lingering fear that the ancient trees might quietly close in behind them, leading them into a silent space where time, distance, and memory simply cease to exist. An Idaho fire tower report from 2003 was never released. The final entry in the publicly released logbook for the Black Mountain Fire Tower simply read, "Weather clear, visibility 10 miles, no smoke detected." But according to internal forestry documents leaked nearly 2 decades later, the actual handwritten log from August 9th, 2003 did not end there. It continued for another 14 pages, cataloging a sequence of events that began at 11:45 p.m. The missing pages did not describe a forest fire, a trespassing hiker, or a sudden storm. Instead, the observer stationed at the tower documented an encounter that began with the ambient sound of the forest abruptly and completely ceasing. The Black Mountain Tower stood 65 feet above a dense, unbroken canopy in the remote reaches of the Clearwater National Forest. It was a standard architectural design for the region, a glass-walled box measuring roughly 14 by 14 feet, accessible only by a steep, exposed wooden staircase. The lookout on duty that summer was a 24-year-old seasonal employee. His name was redacted in all the leaked files, referred to only as the Observer. For the first 6 weeks of his post, his reports were entirely routine, filled with mundane details about humidity, wind speed, and distant lightning strikes. But the August 9th entry shifted in tone almost immediately after nightfall, noting a sudden drop in temperature and a strange, localized fog creeping through the pines directly below his structure. By midnight, the observer reported that his two-way radio had begun emitting a rhythmic, low-frequency pulse. He wrote that he initially assumed it was atmospheric interference and attempted to contact the regional dispatcher. The channel, however, was completely choked by a thick, heavy static. He noted in his log that the pulse sounded biological, like a slow, amplified heartbeat broadcasting directly over the emergency frequency. He turned the volume down, but the vibration of the speaker still rattled against the wooden desk. Seeking the source of the interference, he stepped out onto the narrow metal catwalk that surrounded the glass cabin. The air outside was dead calm. There was no wind to move the trees, yet the observer claimed he could hear the distinct sound of heavy branches snapping in the dark, roughly 200 feet below his position. The logbook described the observer retrieving a high-powered, handheld spotlight from his supply locker. He leaned over the railing and swept the bright beam over the tree line, expecting to catch the reflective eyes of a black bear or a stray elk wandering through the underbrush. Instead, the beam illuminated a patch of the forest floor where the shadows simply did not behave correctly. According to his written account, a cluster of tall, pale shapes stood perfectly still among the dark trunks of the pines. They were thin, much taller than any human, and blended almost seamlessly with the pale bark of the birch trees. The observer noted with a clinical, terrifying detachment that the figures were completely hairless and unnaturally smooth. When the harsh light hit them, they did not scatter or flinch. They simply leaned backward, slipping out of the illuminated circle with a smooth, liquid motion that defied the anatomy of any known animal. At 1:15 a.m., the observer wrote that the pulsing sound on the radio had finally stopped. It was immediately replaced by a faint, wet clicking noise coming from outside the glass walls. He turned off all the lanterns inside the cabin, plunging himself into total darkness so his eyes could adjust to the moonlight and he could see the catwalk. The narrow metal walkway was empty, but the clicking continued. It sounded like long, hardened fingernails tapping rhythmically against the wooden support beams holding the massive tower aloft. The sound was not stationary, it was slowly, methodically moving upward. 10 feet off the ground, 20 feet, 30 feet. Something was climbing the sheer wooden structure, but it was entirely avoiding the wooden stairs. The observer documented his own rising panic with a strange, methodical precision, as if relying on protocol was the only way to maintain his sanity. He recorded the exact time he secured the heavy trapdoor that covered the stairwell entrance. He noted checking the locks on the heavy glass doors on all four sides of the cabin. A few minutes later, he wrote that the thick timber framing of the tower was beginning to groan under an immense shifting weight. Whatever was scaling the exterior was heavy enough to make the 65-foot structure sway slightly, mimicking the motion it usually made only in gale force winds. Yet, the night outside remained perfectly still. There was no breeze to stir the pines, there was only the creaking wood and the relentless, wet clicking ascending the eastern supports. At 2:30 a.m., the tapping stopped just below the edge of the catwalk. The observer sat perfectly still in the center of the dark room, gripping a heavy flashlight, waiting for a face to appear in the windows. For nearly 10 minutes, there was absolute, suffocating silence. Then, a voice spoke from the darkness outside the reinforced glass. The logbook recorded that the voice belonged to the regional dispatcher, the familiar woman who took his daily weather reports. But the dispatcher was stationed at a secure facility more than 30 miles away. Furthermore, the voice lacked any human inflection or breath. It simply repeated the phrase, observer status check, over and over, with the flat, mechanical cadence of a skipping audio recording. The observer did not answer the voice. He remained motionless on the floorboards, barely daring to breathe. He wrote that when he failed to respond, the voice outside began to change. It distorted, deepening into a hollow, metallic drone, though it continued to repeat the exact same phrase. A few moments later, a second voice joined it from the western side of the catwalk. This one sounded like a young child crying softly, a sound that had no logical place in the middle of a remote wilderness in the dead of night. Then a third voice joined the chorus, flawlessly mimicking the rhythmic, low-frequency pulse he had heard earlier on his radio. A chaotic symphony of impossible sounds drifted through the thin glass panes surrounding the cabin entirely. The observer realized they were trying to provoke a response, attempting to trick him into speaking so they could pinpoint his exact location within the dark room. At 3:14 a.m., the observer managed to write his second-to-last entry. The handwriting had become shaky, the letters pressed deeply into the paper. He wrote that a face had finally pressed itself against the glass on the northern side of the cabin. He could only see its outline in the dim moonlight. He described it as impossibly long, pale, and completely smooth, entirely lacking eyes, a nose, or any discernible human features. It had only a wide, dark fissure where a mouth should be. As he watched in paralyzed horror, a long, multi-jointed hand reached up into view and began testing the brass handle of the outer door. The handle turned slowly, clanking heavily against the locked mechanism. The creature did not try to force the door open or break the glass. It simply stood there, patiently testing the lock, while the stolen voices continued to murmur endlessly from the surrounding darkness. The final page of the unredacted logbook contained only a few hurried sentences logged at 3:43 a.m. The handwriting had devolved into a frantic, nearly illegible scrawl. The observer noted that the deep structural groaning of the tower had returned, but this time it was coming from all four sides simultaneously. There was not just one of them waiting outside. The wet clicking filled the air, vibrating violently through the floorboards beneath his boots. The final sentence on the page was heavily underlined. It simply read, "They know the glass is fragile, they are tapping the panes." When the scheduled relief crew arrived 2 days later, the Black Mountain Tower was empty. There was no sign of a struggle, the furniture was undisturbed, and no trace of blood or damage was found inside the cabin. The heavy wooden trapdoor was still securely locked from the inside, meaning whoever left had not used the stairs. The glass windows were entirely intact, but the relief crew noted they were covered in an oily, translucent residue on the outside, spanning from the floor to the roofline. The Forestry Service never publicly identified the substance. The observer's personal belongings, including his keys and wallet, were still neatly packed in his duffel bag beneath the cot. The official report filed by the agency later that month stated that the young man had simply walked off the job, abandoning his post to hike back to civilization due to severe isolation fatigue. The unredacted logbook pages remained buried in classified archives until a Freedom of Information request accidentally uncovered them nearly 2 decades later. The Forestry Service immediately issued a brief statement dismissing the handwritten pages as a creative writing exercise, claiming they were merely a symptom of the observer's declining mental state during his long deployment. But former rangers who worked the Black Mountain District during that era have long shared quiet rumors about the events of that summer. They frequently point out that the fire tower was permanently decommissioned and completely dismantled just 3 weeks after the disappearance, an expensive and unusual procedure for a fully functional structure. And local hikers still whisper about certain windless nights deep in the Clearwater Forest when the woods fall dead silent, and the trees seem to echo with the faint sound of a hollow, lifeless voice endlessly asking for a status check. An Ontario forest camera captured something after midnight. The sequence of photographs began at 2:14 in the morning. David sat alone at his small kitchen table, the the pale glow of the laptop screen casting long, distorted shadows across the empty room as he slowly clicked through the silent captures from trail camera number 4. The first 3 images showed nothing but the dark, freezing timber of the provincial wilderness, illuminated only by the harsh, flat burst of the infrared flash. But the 4th image, time-stamped 2:17 a.m., contained a pale, smeared blur at the extreme edge of the tree line. It was tall, far too tall to be a wolf or a roaming black bear, and its shape did not make geometric sense in the context of the dense, tangled brush. David was a field biologist studying seasonal migration patterns deep in the sprawling, unbroken forests of northern Ontario. It was a profoundly lonely profession, one that required long, uninterrupted stretches of isolation in a rudimentary cabin located 50 miles from the nearest paved road. The surrounding landscape was a vast, unforgiving ocean of black spruce, cedar, and birch, a place where the deep winter cold could snap a dry branch with the echoing sound of a rifle shot. To monitor the wildlife without disturbing them, David relied on a wide network of 30 motion-activated trail cameras, heavily strapped to tree trunks along natural game trails and frozen creeks. Camera number 4 was his most remote station. It was located 3 miles deep into a heavily wooded valley that the older locals and indigenous guides simply called the Black Ridge. It was a notoriously quiet patch of timber. According to regional historical records, a commercial logging company had attempted to clear the ridge in 1922, but they completely abandoned the camp after only 2 months. The official reports cited logistical failures and severe, unpredictable weather, but rumors persisted for decades that the lumberjacks simply refused to work in the deep shadows of those particular trees. They claimed the woods were unnatural, entirely devoid of animal sounds, and that their heavy equipment was constantly being dragged or moved in the middle of the night. David had never paid much attention to local folklore. He was a man of strict science, relying entirely on data, timestamps, and observable facts. When he had hiked out to retrieve the memory card from the Black Ridge earlier that afternoon, the heavy plastic casing of the camera had been covered in a thick, undisturbed layer of frost. It had sat in the silent woods, untouched by human hands, for 4 long weeks. Now, sitting alone in his locked cabin, with the diesel generator humming softly outside and the freezing wind picking up off the surface of the frozen lake, the digital data he was observing was beginning to defy all scientific logic. He clicked to the next photograph. The timestamp read 2:18 a.m. The pale blur had moved closer to the center of the frame. It was entirely motionless in the frozen capture, yet it was distinctly closer to the lens. The camera's infrared sensor rendered everything in stark, ghostly shades of gray, black, and white, and whatever this entity was, it reflected the invisible flash with an unnatural, sickening intensity. It looked like a towering figure wrapped in something damp and ragged, or perhaps something that had no clear defining physical edges. Its limbs, if they could accurately be called limbs, seemed terribly long, bending at subtle, wrong angles that defied the natural mechanics of bone and joint. David zoomed in on the image, leaning closer to the monitor, watching the pixels dissolve into grainy white noise. A cold, prickling sensation crept slowly up the back of his neck. He glanced up from the screen, his eyes darting toward the cabin window. Beyond the thick glass, the night was absolute, suffocating black. He suddenly felt acutely aware of exactly how far he was from any other living human being. If he were to scream, the sound would simply be swallowed by the millions of silent trees surrounding him. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, forced his eyes back to the glowing screen, and pressed the right arrow key. According to the digital data embedded in the image files, the motion sensor was being triggered precisely every 60 seconds. A passing deer, a lynx, or even a wandering moose would have walked through the narrow frame and vanished into the brush within moments. But this presence was intentionally lingering. It was deliberately staying within the camera's narrow field of view. He clicked forward. 2:19 a.m., 2:20 a.m., 2:21 a.m. In each successive photograph, the pale figure shifted slightly, inching agonizingly closer to the hidden lens. The movement was entirely linear, a slow, methodical approach entirely devoid of the erratic, nervous caution of a wild animal. By 2:24 a.m., the pale mass occupied the entire left half of the image. The face, if it possessed a face, was completely obscured by a smooth, featureless stretch of pale, tightly stretched gray. There were no reflective eyes catching the infrared light, no snout, no visible ears. Yet, the overall posture of the towering thing suggested a terrifyingly intense focus. It was looking directly down into the lens. It was observing the small, blinking red light of the motion sensor just as intently as the camera was observing it. The wind outside his cabin began to howl through the eaves, rattling the loose pane of glass in the living room window with a rapid, violent shaking. David paused his clicking, his finger hovering over the keyboard. He listened to the bitter draft whistling through the log walls, a sound he had heard 1,000 times before, but tonight it sounded hollow, almost mournful in the dark. The cast-iron wood stove in the corner of the room popped loudly, making his shoulders jump. He rubbed his tired eyes, trying desperately to rationalize what he was looking at. He told himself it was a technical artifact of the flash, a trick of falling snow and deep shadows, a piece of birch bark caught in a spiderweb directly in front of the lens. He looked back at the screen. The timestamp on the next file was 2:30 a.m. A gap of exactly 6 minutes had passed where the camera had captured absolutely nothing. He hesitated for a long moment before pressing the key. The image captured at 2:30 a.m. was almost entirely blinding white. At first, David thought the camera had finally malfunctioned, completely blinded by a sudden flurry of heavy snow reflecting the intense flash. But as his eyes slowly adjusted to the harsh contrast, his breath caught sharply in his throat. He realized the white mass filling the screen was the actual surface of the thing itself. It was standing mere inches from the camera lens. The physical texture of it was entirely wrong. It did not look like rough fabric, nor did it look like thick animal fur. It looked like stretched, damp parchment, pulled agonizingly tight over an unseen, shifting frame. Near the upper right corner of the frame, there was a dark, cavernous void. A jagged, asymmetrical tear in the pale mass that faintly resembled a hollow, silently screaming mouth. And behind that terrible void, the dark outline of the familiar pine trees was completely blocked out. The entity was massive. It was entirely suffocating the camera. David pushed his wooden chair heavily back from the table. The scraping sound across the floorboards echoed far too loudly in the silent, empty cabin. He stood up, pacing the small confines of the kitchen, his heart hammering rhythmically against his ribs. He tried to build a logical, scientific explanation. Perhaps a large white owl had swooped down and temporarily covered the lens with its massive wing. Perhaps a wandering moose had pressed its wet nose directly against the plastic casing. He repeated these logical scenarios in his mind, trying to anchor himself firmly to reality, but the logic felt incredibly fragile. An owl would not have taken 16 minutes to slowly approach the camera from the distant tree line. A moose would have triggered the sensitive motion sensor with its massive bulk long before it ever reached the lens. He forced himself to sit back down in the wooden chair. There were still 22 unread photos left in the designated computer folder. He took a slow, shaky breath and pressed the arrow key. 2:31 a.m. The lens was perfectly clear again. The pale, suffocating figure was entirely gone. The forest looked perfectly normal. An empty, mundane corridor of dark evergreens standing silent in the freezing night. David let out a long, heavy breath, feeling a sudden, rushing wave of profound relief wash over him. It was gone. Whatever the anomaly was, it had finally moved on. He clicked to the next image, expecting to see nothing but empty, static woods until dawn. The timestamp read 2:32 a.m. The woods were indeed still empty, but there was a single, terrifying detail in the lower right corner of the frame that immediately caught his attention. It was a fresh footprint pressed deep into the light dusting of snow on the forest floor. In the previous clear image, the snow had been completely undisturbed. Now there was a deep, elongated impression. It was far too long and wide to be a human boot, and it possessed no distinct toes, claws, or animal pads. It was simply a heavy, crushing, dragging mark that smeared roughly through the frost, deeply exposing the dark earth beneath. He clicked rapidly through the next 15 photos. 2:35 a.m., 2:40 a.m., 2:45 a.m., 2:52 a.m. The woods remained entirely empty. The single footprint remained perfectly untouched by wind or fresh snow. Yet, the camera continued to trigger. It fired its silent flash into the absolute void of the forest over and over again, capturing nothing but static trees and that single, strange track. This slow realization chilled David to his absolute core. If the camera was entirely motion-activated, something heavy and substantial was still moving out there in the dark. It was either moving far too fast for the digital shutter to capture, or it was moving just outside the narrow cone of the camera's vision, pacing endlessly back and forth in the blind spots. As David reached the very end of the digital folder, he noticed a deeply unsettling pattern in the timestamps of the final 5 photographs. They were no longer being triggered minutes apart. They were triggering mere seconds apart, as if the sensor was being completely overwhelmed by frantic, rapid motion. 3 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock and 12 seconds, 3 o'clock and 25 seconds. He cycled through them, the images flashing rapidly on his screen like a crude, disjointed stop-motion film. In the first 3 images, the forest was perfectly still and empty. But in the 4th image, captured at exactly 3 o'clock and 38 seconds, the entire perspective of the camera had violently shifted. The lens was no longer pointing straight down the frozen game trail. It was pointing directly upward into the dense, tangled canopy of the dark trees. The heavy canvas strap used to secure the camera to the trunk, a thick woven band rated for hundreds of pounds of pressure, had been snapped with incredible, sudden force. The final photograph in the folder, taken at 3 o'clock and 40 seconds, was captured while the camera was in a chaotic state of freefall. It was a blurry, deeply disorienting smear of dark branches, falling snow, and pitch-black sky. But in the very center of that chaotic blur, illuminated briefly by the dying burst of the flash, was an incredibly long, pale, multi-jointed appendage reaching straight down from the high branches above. It bent back upon itself in a sickening, impossible geometry, its surface perfectly matching the damp parchment texture of the pale mass from earlier. It was reaching down through the air, grasping blindly toward the falling camera. David did not sleep a single minute that night. He sat frozen at his kitchen table until the dull, gray light of a winter dawn finally crept slowly through the frosted windows, his tired eyes fixed, unblinking, on that final, blurry image. When the winter sun was fully above the tree line, he packed a heavy rifle, loaded his truck, and drove the 3 miles down the rutted, icy logging road. He parked at the dead end and hiked the final mile into the Black Ridge section on foot, determined to retrieve his broken equipment and prove to himself that this was all an elaborate prank by local hunters or a bizarre mechanical failure. When he finally located the specific pine tree where camera number 4 had been mounted, the torn remnants of the canvas strap were still dangling loosely from the rough bark, its thick edges violently frayed and torn. The heavy, reinforced plastic casing of the camera lay shattered into a dozen jagged pieces on the frozen, unforgiving ground. The small alkaline batteries were scattered in the white snow, completely drained of all their power. He gathered the broken pieces of plastic in complete silence, his gloved hand gripping the leather strap of his rifle tightly, his eyes constantly scanning the dense, overarching canopy of heavy pine branches above his head. The woods around him were utterly, unnaturally silent. There were no winter birds calling in the distance, no wind whistling through the dry needles, no sound of small animals scurrying through the dead underbrush. It felt like standing completely still inside a vacuum. As he finally turned to leave the ridge, eager to get back to the safety and warmth of his truck, he looked down at the wide base of the massive pine tree. The morning sun had melted some of the lighter frost, but in the damp, exposed earth around the thick roots, he found a continuous, unbroken series of those deep, dragged impressions. They did not lead away into the deeper forest, nor did they lead back toward the established game trail. The massive, dragging tracks circled the base of the tree, over and over again, trampling the loose soil into a dark, muddy, chaotic ring before simply stopping directly beneath the thickest, highest branches. According to provincial employment records, David never returned to the Black Ridge area, nor did he ever finish his research contract. He submitted his seasonal ecological report a full month early, packed up his remote cabin in a single afternoon, and relocated to a completely different wildlife reserve over 400 miles away. The memory card containing the late-night infrared images was reportedly locked away in a private safety deposit box, never published in any of his official surveys, and never shown to his academic colleagues. To this day, local hunters and brave hikers who venture too far into the deep, silent timber of northern Ontario sometimes report finding strange, deep tracks circling the base of the oldest trees. And in the small, isolated logging towns bordering the vast wilderness, a quiet, persistent rumor still survives among those who spend their lives in the woods. They say that if you leave a camera out in the deep timber overnight, you should never review the footage taken between 2 and 3 o'clock in the morning. Because whatever slowly wanders the Black Ridge at that hour is learning exactly how the blinking cameras work, and it does not like being watched. A British Columbia forest report was filed and then removed. The digital log appeared on the regional supervisor's terminal at 3:14 a.m., tagged with a priority code that had not been used in the British Columbia Provincial Forestry Network in over 20 years. The supervisor, a man who had spent 3 decades monitoring the vast, unmapped expanses of the coastal wilderness, sat forward in his chair. The night shift in the Victoria Dispatch Office was usually quiet, punctuated only by the occasional automated weather update or a routine check-in from a logging crew. But this was different. The flashing alert on his screen indicated a code-red environmental anomaly. It had been submitted by a senior timber cruiser stationed deep in a remote, protected sector of the Great Bear Rainforest, more than 200 miles from the nearest paved road. The supervisor clicked to open the file. The surveyor had uploaded a text document containing 3 short paragraphs and a single, low-resolution audio attachment. The text did not describe a wildfire, an aggressive grizzly bear, or a poaching camp. Instead, the seasoned surveyor described an area of old-growth cedar where the topography had seemingly folded in on itself overnight. He wrote that the tree trunks in a 2-mile radius had turned entirely white, drained of all color and moisture, and that the ambient air pressure was fluctuating so violently it had cracked the glass face of his analog compass. The final sentence of the text report simply read, "They are emitting a low, continuous mechanical hum." Before the supervisor could click the play button on the audio file, his screen flashed a sudden, flat gray. The terminal froze for a fraction of a second, the cooling fan humming loudly in the empty office. When the system refreshed and the network connection stabilized, the inbox was completely empty. The glowing red priority alert was gone. The submission log, which recorded every piece of incoming data down to the microsecond, showed no entry for that hour. The report had not just been deleted or moved to a spam folder. According to the architecture of the provincial server, the file had never existed. The supervisor immediately picked up his desk phone and called the Overnight Information Technology Department. He woke a technician who remotely accessed the regional router to run a diagnostic trace. The technician sounded confused as he reported his findings. He confirmed that a data packet of significant size had indeed pinged the primary receiver at exactly 3:14 a.m., but the origin node was now returning a fatal error. Someone or something had executed a hard scrub of the network. Furthermore, the GPS coordinates attached to the surveyor's transmission were now blocked out on the digital map. The sector, a dense valley previously mapped and surveyed dozens of times, was now registered in the database as a blank, unassigned zone. By 6 o'clock in the morning, a quiet panic had begun to set in among the upper management of the forestry department. The surveyor was a veteran of the woods, a man who spent months alone in the deep bush and was known for his grounded, pragmatic nature. He was not prone to exaggeration, and he certainly did not possess the technical capability to hack a secure government database to erase his own reports. The department authorized a private helicopter charter to fly over the coordinates at first light, bypassing the official search and rescue channels to avoid drawing unwanted attention to the missing data. The pilot reached the airspace above the valley at 8:30 a.m. The weather across the coast was clear, with bright morning sunlight illuminating the endless sea of green pine and cedar. But as the helicopter banked over the specific coordinates, the pilot radioed back to dispatch with a hesitant voice. A perfectly circular column of thick gray fog was rising from the valley floor, obscuring the canopy entirely. The fog was not drifting with the wind. It remained entirely stationary, rising like a solid pillar. The pilot noted that as he passed within 1 mile of the fog bank, his instrument panel began to flicker, and a loud, rhythmic static washed out his communication relay. He was ordered to return to base immediately. A small, specialized ground crew was assembled 48 hours later. They were briefed only that a surveyor had missed his scheduled satellite check-in and that equipment failure was suspected. The team drove for 6 hours up deteriorating logging routes, finally abandoning their trucks when the mud became too deep. They hiked for another 2 days through the dense, wet undergrowth of the rainforest. The expedition leader later noted in his personal journal that the transition into the surveyor's sector was not gradual. It happened over the course of a single step. One moment, the team was walking through a vibrant, noisy ecosystem filled with the sounds of dripping water, rustling leaves, and calling birds. The next moment, they crossed an invisible threshold into absolute, suffocating silence. The air grew instantly cold, and the smell of damp earth was replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of ozone. The forest floor here was covered in a fine, pale dust that resembled ash, though there were no signs of a fire. As they pushed deeper into the valley, they saw the trees. Just as the deleted report had described, the towering ancient cedars had been stripped of their bark and color. The wood was bone white, smooth to the touch, and strangely warm. The branches were completely bare, reaching up into a canopy that was shrouded in the unnatural, stationary fog. The ground team moved slowly, their unease growing with every silent step. There was no wind, yet the white trees seemed to vibrate slightly, transferring a deep, sub-audible tremor through the soles of the searchers' boots. They found the surveyor's camp just before dusk. The heavy canvas tent was fully erected and entirely untouched. His camp stove, climbing gear, and emergency rations were neatly organized on a folding table. The site showed no signs of a struggle, no animal tracks, and no indication of a hasty departure. However, when the expedition leader unzipped the tent to look inside, he found the surveyor's heavy winter jacket laid perfectly flat on the sleeping bag. The jacket was completely dehydrated. The synthetic fabric crumbled into brittle flakes when the leader tried to pick it up, as if all moisture had been instantly baked out of it in a vacuum. Sitting beside the crumbled jacket was the surveyor's physical logbook. It was a heavy, leather-bound ledger required by the province for legal record-keeping. The leader opened it, hoping to find a written copy of the deleted digital report. The first 40 pages were filled with mundane daily notes, weather observations, and soil acidity measurements. But the pages covering the final 3 days of his deployment had been removed. They were not torn out in a rush. They had been excised with surgical precision, sliced perfectly down the binding so that barely a paper fiber remained. The only electronic device left in the camp was a secondary handheld GPS unit resting on a stump outside the tent. The search team gathered around it as the technician powered the screen on. The battery was somehow fully charged. It took a moment to acquire a satellite lock. When the numbers finally populated on the display, the team stared at the screen in silence. According to the uncorrupted hardware, their current elevation was not 4,000 feet above sea level, where they should have been. The device registered their elevation as a negative number, insisting they were currently standing 3 miles beneath the surface of the Earth. The expedition leader ordered an immediate retreat. The team hiked through the night, using headlamps to navigate the maze of bleached, vibrating trees, desperate to reach the tree line where the normal forest resumed. They left the camp exactly as they found it, taking only the corrupted GPS unit and the altered logbook. They spoke very little on the long drive back to civilization, each man privately haunted by the sheer, unnatural wrongness of the dead valley. When the team submitted their findings to the regional office, the response was swift and bureaucratic. The photographs they took of the white trees were confiscated and classified under a vague Environmental Protection Act. The anomalous GPS unit was sent to a federal laboratory in Ottawa and never returned. The surveyor was officially declared lost in the woods, his disappearance attributed to a tragic, unverified fall into a fast-moving river. A public warning was issued designating the specific coordinates as an unstable landslide zone, strictly off-limits to all hikers and commercial logging operations. The regional supervisor, who had seen the original, vanished report, chose to retire early a few months later. He packed up his desk, handed over his keys, and moved to a small town on the eastern edge of the province, far away from the deep woods. But he could never quite shake the memory of that night shift. He often thought about the speed with which the system had scrubbed the file, a deliberate erasure executed from a level of authority he could not even comprehend. Most of all, he thought about the audio file he never got to hear. Years later, rumors began to circulate among the older forest rangers. They whispered about illegal, deep earth acoustic scanning taking place in the remote sectors. They traded stories about campers who wandered too close to the hazard zones and reported hearing a sound that carried on the wind. It was not the sound of a landslide or a river or an animal. According to the locals who lived near the edge of the deep wilderness, on particularly quiet nights, you could stand at the boundary line and hear a low, continuous mechanical hum rising from beneath the roots of the trees. A missing 411 case where footprints suddenly stopped. The footprints in the morning frost did not fade away slowly, nor did they show any signs of a struggle or a sudden violent fall. They simply stopped. It was near the edge of a high granite ridge, about 2 miles north of the main trail, in an area of the state forest thick with ancient pine and jagged limestone outcroppings. The search coordinator, a man who had spent 30 years tracking missing persons through these specific mountains, knelt and stared at the final depression in the pale white earth. The left boot print was deep, pressing heavily through the crisp layer of frost and into the damp, dark soil beneath. There was no right boot print to follow it. Beyond that single heavy indentation, there was only a vast, undisturbed sheet of frost covering the flat stone of the ridge. Nothing had brushed against the nearby ferns. No low-hanging branches were broken. It was as if the man had stepped forward with his left foot and simply ceased to be tethered to the ground. The geography of the upper basin was notoriously deceptive, a sprawling network of deep ravines and dense timber that could easily turn a seasoned hiker around. But the missing man was not a tourist. His name was Elias, a local surveyor who knew the topography of the northern ridge better than anyone in the county. He had walked out of his small cabin at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in late October. The air that day had been crisp but clear, the kind of autumn morning that drew locals deep into the woods before the heavy winter snows arrived. He was dressed appropriately for the season in a heavy wool jacket, sturdy leather boots, and carried a small canvas pack with enough supplies to last well through the afternoon. According to the missing person report, Elias had only intended to check a line of remote trail cameras he maintained along the eastern edge of the property line. His wife told the 911 operator that he knew every stone and creek in that section of the woods. He had promised to return by noon for lunch. When 3 o'clock in the afternoon passed with no sign of him, a quiet, creeping unease settled over the house. When dusk arrived, bringing with it a sharp drop in temperature and the deep, total darkness of the mountain valley, that unease turned into a pressing emergency. By midnight, the first official search teams had already assembled at the trailhead with high-powered flashlights, radios, and a team of tracking dogs. The tracking dogs provided the first clear indication that this would not be a standard search and rescue operation. The handlers brought 3 experienced bloodhounds to the front porch of the cabin, allowing them to catch Elias's scent from a worn flannel shirt. Initially, the dogs performed exactly as trained. They pulled eagerly at their long leashes, leading the handlers up the familiar winding incline behind the property. They moved swiftly for the first hour, cutting through the dense, dark timber with absolute purpose, their noses close to the damp earth. But as the search party crossed the lower tree line and entered the shadow of the upper ridge, the behavior of the animals drastically changed. The lead dog suddenly stopped pulling. It lowered its head, sniffing frantically at a single patch of dead, frozen grass, before letting out a low, trembling whine and backing away. Within minutes, all 3 dogs sat rigidly in the cold dirt, refusing to take another step forward. They did not bark at the darkness. They did not circle looking for a lost scent. They simply sat close to their handlers, staring up into the black canopy of the towering pines, shivering violently despite their thick coats. The handlers eventually had to carry the dogs back down the trail, leaving the human volunteers to push forward alone. Witnesses in the search party later claimed that the woods felt entirely dead that night. The wind, which usually howled relentlessly through the narrow canyons of the basin, had dropped to an absolute unnatural standstill. The silence was so profound and heavy that the searchers could hear the blood rushing in their own ears, and the rhythmic squeak of their waterproof gear seemed to echo for miles. Usually, the forest at night was alive with the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the sharp creak of settling wood, and the distant, lonely call of owls. But on that night, several seasoned rangers reported feeling an immense, suffocating pressure in the air, as if they were walking through the interior of a massive, soundproof room. Every beam of light sweeping through the trees seemed to stop short, swallowed by an unusual density in the dark. At 3:30 a.m., a team of volunteers sweeping the floor of the lower ravine found the first physical piece of evidence. It was Elias's canvas backpack sitting perfectly upright on the flat, mossy surface of a large river boulder. It had not been dropped in a panic or thrown aside in a rush. The shoulder straps were neatly arranged, tucked carefully beneath the base of the bag, and all the buckles were securely fastened. Inside, they found his metal water bottle entirely full, alongside his compass and a spare pair of heavy insulated gloves. The most unsettling detail of the discovery was the placement of his two-way radio. It was resting perfectly balanced on top of the closed backpack. The power switch was turned on, indicating the battery was still alive, but the volume dial had been rotated completely down to 0. It was a bizarre and troubling contradiction. A man lost or injured in the wilderness relies on a radio as his primary lifeline to the outside world. To deliberately silence the device and abandon it so carefully on a rock suggested either a calm, intentional choice to vanish or a state of mind that could no longer comprehend the concept of rescue. As the sun finally rose, casting long, pale, gray shadows across the basin, the trackers located a distinct set of boot prints in the soft mud near the boulder. The tracks clearly belonged to Elias, perfectly matching the heavy, deep-lugged tread pattern of his winter boots, but the path they carved through the landscape made no logical sense. Instead of heading back down the gradual slope toward the safety of the valley and the highway, the prints turned away from home. They aimed directly toward the steepest, most unforgiving section of the mountain, a tangled mass of briars and loose scree. According to the lead rescue coordinator, the stride of the footprints was deeply alarming. The distance between the left and right impressions was impossibly wide. The spacing suggested that Elias was either running at a breakneck, desperate speed up a 45-degree incline, or taking massive, leaping bounds through thick underbrush that should have been physically impenetrable. A human being could not maintain that kind of momentum up a mountain face without tripping, stumbling, or leaving signs of broken branches and crushed vegetation. Yet, the tracks were clean, perfectly spaced, and relentless in their upward trajectory. 200 yards further up the punishing incline, the team found another piece of the puzzle, and it only deepened the growing sense of dread. Draped carefully over a low-hanging hemlock branch was Elias's heavy wool winter jacket. It was not torn, snagged, or hastily discarded. It had been meticulously unbuttoned, taken off, and folded neatly over the damp wood. The temperature in the valley had dipped to 28 degrees overnight. Stripping off a primary layer of winter clothing in sub-freezing conditions is a recognized symptom of late-stage hypothermia, a fatal phenomenon known as paradoxical undressing, where a freezing brain falsely signals to the body that it is burning up. Yet, the veteran trackers noted immediately that the timeline for hypothermia simply did not fit the physical evidence. Based on the distance from his cabin, Elias would have reached this specific spot only 2 or 3 hours after leaving home, far too early for the deep, delirious final stages of freezing to set in. Furthermore, the victims of hypothermia walk with a staggering, chaotic gait as their motor functions shut down. Elias's footprints leading away from the abandoned jacket remain straight, deep, and incredibly wide, showing a level of physical power and purpose that directly contradicted the symptoms of a dying man. At 9:15 a.m., the radio operator stationed back at the base camp experienced a highly unusual anomaly. For several uninterrupted minutes, a burst of thick, heavy static broke through the primary search and rescue channel. The operator attempted to clear the frequency, asking for any team in the field to identify themselves and report their status. The static did not break. Instead, it slowly shifted in tone and pitch, forming a rhythmic mechanical pulse that sounded almost like heavy, labored breathing, echoing through miles of empty, hollow pipe. Behind the dense wall of static, faint, metallic clicking sounds began to echo in a slow, deliberate, and entirely unnatural pattern. The transmission lasted for exactly 2 minutes before the channel snapped back to dead, empty silence. The operator immediately radioed all the search teams in the field. Every unit confirmed that their radios were secure and none of them had triggered their microphones. The origin of the signal was never traced, and no other frequencies in the area reported the interference. By 11 o'clock in the morning, the primary tracking team finally reached the high granite ridge. The punishing terrain here leveled out into a barren, windswept expanse of pale stone, broken only by thin, shallow patches of frosted soil and dead moss. This was the exact location where they found the final, impossible sequence of footprints. They followed the wide, bounding strides across a shallow depression of dirt that led toward the sudden drop-off of the cliff. The tracks moved in a perfectly straight, unwavering line. The searchers walked parallel to the prints, giving them a wide berth, deeply careful not to disturb the evidence. They counted exactly 12 massive steps across the morning frost. And then there was the 13th step. The left boot drove deep into the soft, yielding earth, crushing a thick layer of dead green moss. The toe of the print was angled slightly forward, deeply embedded, implying a tremendous amount of forward momentum. But there was absolutely no right footprint to follow it. The trackers instantly fanned out, circling the immediate area in a wide 50-foot radius. They shone high-powered flashlights into the narrow, dark crevices of the surrounding rock. They swept the distant tree line, looking for any sign of broken timber. They looked for signs that Elias had jumped to another rock, but the nearest boulder was 30 feet away. They looked for signs of a sudden fall, a dragging rope, or the massive sweeping tracks of a large predator that might have carried a man away. There was nothing to be found. The earth was entirely undisturbed. The delicate crystalline frost on the granite just inches away from that final boot print remained entirely intact, glittering like broken glass under the cold, pale sunlight. The trail simply ceased to exist. As the searchers stood in a circle around the impossible end of the trail, the atmosphere in the upper basin violently shifted. The oppressive, heavy silence of the morning was suddenly broken by a deep, low humming wind that seemed to vibrate directly through the thick rubber soles of their boots. The sky above the ridge, which had been a clear, piercing, cloudless blue just moments before, darkened with a terrifying and unnatural speed. Thick, bruised gray clouds rolled over the jagged peaks, sealing the valley floor in a sudden, premature twilight. The temperature plummeted 10 degrees in a matter of minutes, chilling the sweat on the necks of the searchers. Small, hard pellets of ice began to fall from the blackening sky, striking the granite ridge with sharp, rhythmic taps that sounded like scattering nails. The lead rescue coordinator knew the brutal protocol for sudden mountain weather. A squall moving this fast in the upper basin could easily trap, freeze, and kill an entire team of experienced men. Reluctantly, with a heavy heart, he keyed his radio and gave the absolute order to abandon the ridge and fall back to the staging area. The men cast one last, long look at the single, final boot print resting alone in the frost before turning away and beginning the dangerous descent. By the time they reached the safety of the lower tree line, the snow was falling in heavy, blinding horizontal sheets. The unseasonal storm locked the mountain down for 3 full days, burying the high ridge under 4 feet of dense, heavy, wet snow. The weather effectively erased the strange trail, destroyed any remaining scent markers, and buried whatever evidence might have been left on the stone. When the deep thaw finally came weeks later, local rangers made one last quiet attempt to search the high areas of the basin. They did not find Elias. They did not find his remains, his missing clothing, or his other boot. They did, however, find one of the remote trail cameras he had gone out into the woods to check on that very first morning. It was strapped tightly to the trunk of an old birch tree about 1 mile south of where his footprints had inexplicably vanished. The plastic outer casing of the camera was deeply cracked, and the battery cover was missing, but the memory card sealed inside the waterproof housing was miraculously still intact. Investigators pulled the memory card and reviewed the digital footage in a locked, windowless room back at the local ranger station. According to the heavily redacted incident report later obtained by researchers, the camera had captured only a single, silent photograph at 2:45 p.m. on the day Elias disappeared. The image was incredibly grainy, shot in poor lighting under the dense, shadowing canopy of the pines. In the extreme foreground of the image, the very edge of Elias's heavy wool jacket was partially visible. It was slightly out of focus and blurred, capturing the exact moment he was walking past the hidden lens. But the true focus of the camera's automated sensor was drawn to the distant background. Deep in the dark, tangled timber, perfectly aligned with the direction Elias was walking, the shapes of the ancient trees appeared strangely distorted and bent. The shadows in the photograph did not match the natural angle of the afternoon sun. Instead, the darkness seemed to pool together into a single, unnatural, towering shape that stood between the trees, appearing to absorb all the ambient light around it. There were no distinct facial features, no reflections of eyes, and no recognizable outline of a natural animal. It was just a profound, empty, towering mass of darkness standing perfectly still among the pines, waiting on the exact path that Elias was walking toward. The case of the missing surveyor remains officially open, filed quietly under unexplained local disappearances. The dense woods surrounding the upper basin were eventually closed to casual hikers, with the state citing dangerously unstable terrain and deeply unpredictable weather patterns as the official reason. But those who have lived in the shadow of the valley for generations still talk quietly about the man who walked up the mountain and simply stepped off the face of the earth. The story has woven itself into the fabric of the local folklore, becoming a whispered warning passed down to young hunters. They say that sometimes, in the absolute dead of winter, when the biting wind completely drops and the ancient trees grow utterly, unnaturally silent, you can still find massive, wide, bounding footprints carved deeply into the fresh snow. Those foolish enough to track them follow the impossible strides for miles, winding through the darkest and most isolated parts of the forest until they finally reach an open clearing or a high, lonely ridge. And there, alone in the freezing, absolute silence, the tracks always stop. An Appalachian cabin case with no footprints leading in or out. It was 3 o'clock in the morning when Deputy Miller reached the tree line. The snow was knee-deep and completely untouched, pale and luminous under the light of a fractured moon. No tracks led up to the porch. No paths broke the smooth, glittering surface of the drifts. Yet, the heavy oak front door of the cabin was standing wide open, a dark, gaping rectangle against the weathered wood. A single lantern swung gently from the rafters inside, casting long, erratic shadows across the snow-covered threshold. The county dispatcher had received the call exactly 1 hour earlier, a frantic voice whispering that someone was outside the windows. But the fresh powder, undisturbed for at least 12 hours, told a different, impossible story. The cabin sat at the end of an unnamed logging road, a mile and a half from County Route 44, buried deep within the Appalachian spine. It belonged to an older man, a retired archivist who spent his winters in total isolation, seeking the heavy, suffocating silence of the deep woods. For nearly 20 years, the man had never called emergency services. He was known in the nearest town only as a shadow who bought bulk supplies in November and disappeared until the spring thaw. But according to the 911 operator who took the call at 2:15 a.m., the man had been entirely coherent, speaking in a low, terrified hush. He claimed he could hear heavy, wet footsteps circling the exterior walls, pressing against the glass. He said they sounded like someone walking in soaked leather boots. Miller stood at the edge of the clearing, his breath pluming in the freezing air. The temperature was 10 degrees below zero, cold enough to make the moisture in his nose freeze with every inhalation. He aimed his heavy flashlight at the ground, sweeping the blinding beam across the expanse of snow, separating the forest edge from the cabin. Nothing. The snow was a pristine, glittering sheet stretching out for 50 yards in every direction. Not a single indentation, not an animal track, not a displaced branch. If someone had been circling the cabin just 45 minutes ago, they had done it without ever touching the ground. He approached slowly, forcing his way through the deep drifts, creating the only trail in the entire clearing. The silence was absolute, the kind of crushing quiet that makes the ears ring and the heart beat too loud. As he stepped onto the wooden porch, the boards groaned under his heavy winter boots. He drew his service weapon, his fingers stiff and clumsy inside his thick gloves. He called out, his voice swallowed instantly by the dense trees and the falling snow. No answer came from the dark interior. There was only the rhythmic creak of the swinging lantern, its fuel nearly exhausted, the flame sputtering and throwing wild, shifting shadows against the log walls. Miller crossed the threshold, stepping out of the wind and into the gloom. The inside of the cabin was freezing, the iron stove in the corner entirely cold, radiating a deep, metallic chill. But there was a scent in the air that did not belong in the high mountains during winter. It was not the familiar smell of pine, wood smoke, or old paper. It smelled heavily of stagnant water, river mud, and wet, decaying earth. It was a thick, humid odor that clung to the back of the throat. He shined his light across the wooden floorboards, moving past the small kitchen area. There, clearly illuminated in the harsh white beam, was a trail of dark, wet footprints. The prints began abruptly in the center of the room, far from the doors and windows. They were large, the shape of a heavy work boot without treads, caked in thick, dark mud that was already beginning to freeze into rigid ridges on the floor. Miller followed the trail with his flashlight, his breathing growing shallow. The prints did not lead toward the open front door. They did not lead toward the rear window, which was bolted shut from the inside with a heavy iron latch. They walked in a tight, deliberate circle around a faded armchair facing the cold fireplace. The tracks overlapped, pacing over and over in the exact same loop, tracking freezing mud deep into the fibers of a braided wool rug. The armchair was empty. A thick wool blanket lay tangled on the floor beside it, as if someone had stood up in a blind panic, kicking it away. On the small wooden side table, a ceramic cup of coffee sat untouched. Miller stepped closer, careful not to disturb the muddy tracks, and pressed the side of the mug with his bare knuckle. It was still warm. The archivist had been sitting here, drinking coffee in the dead of the night, while something paced around him in tight, muddy circles. And then the old man was simply gone, leaving no trace of a struggle and no tracks leading away. Miller raised his light, searching the rafters, the dark corners, the narrow loft above the bed. The cabin was a single open room with nowhere to hide. He walked toward the telephone mounted on the far wall near the pantry. The receiver was dangling by its coiled cord, swaying slightly, a faint dial tone hissing like static in the quiet room. Beneath the phone, a small yellow notepad lay open on a slanted wooden desk. A pen had rolled off the edge and lay on the floorboards. The final entry on the notepad was written in hurried, uneven handwriting, pressing so hard into the paper that the pen had nearly torn through the page. It was completely unlike the precise, careful script found in the rest of the notebooks stacked on the desk. The ink was still fresh, smeared at the edges by a trembling hand. It read simply, "They are not outside." The realization settled over Miller like ice water against the spine. The panicked call to the 911 operator had not been a plea for help against an intruder in the snow. It had been a desperate, fatal misinterpretation. The heavy, wet footsteps the man heard through the walls were not echoing from the woods, they were echoing from the floorboards directly behind his chair. Backup arrived 2 hours later, fighting their way up the snow-choked logging road with tire chains and floodlights. They found Miller sitting on the front porch, staring out at the unbroken expanse of snow, his radio turned off. They tore the cabin apart, looking for hidden compartments or cellar doors, but found nothing but solid earth beneath the foundation. They searched the woods for a radius of 5 miles, bringing in tracking dogs at dawn. The dogs refused to approach the cabin, whining and pulling back toward the cruisers. They dragged the frozen creek down in the valley. They found no trace of the archivist, not a single scrap of clothing, not a drop of blood. Furthermore, they found no explanation for the mud inside the cabin, which laboratory testing later revealed was composed of brackish sediment from a coastal swamp basin located over 400 miles away. The case file was eventually boxed away, labeled as an unsolved disappearance, though the details were heavily redacted in the public reports. Local residents rarely speak of the old cabin, and even seasoned hunters refuse to track through that specific section of the woods during the winter months. To this day, the official records maintain the impossible contradiction of that night. The wet mud inside the cabin remained frozen onto the floorboards for weeks. The snow outside remained perfectly undisturbed until the spring thaw melted it away. The archivist never walked out of that front door, but something else walked in, leaving its filth on the floor without ever taking a step across the snow. A Maine case from 1994 involved knocking for 7 nights. It started on the second night of November 1994 at exactly 2:15 a.m., with a sound that did not belong in the deep, isolated woods of northern Maine. A heavy, rhythmic thudding against the thick, double-paned glass of a sliding patio door. Sarah Elias woke with a sudden, freezing jolt, the heavy woolen blankets pulled tightly up to her chin. The cabin was entirely dark, the surrounding forest swallowed by a black, moonless winter night. She lay perfectly still in her second-floor bedroom, her breath creating faint clouds in the freezing air, waiting to see if the sound had been born from a fading dream. 10 seconds later, the sound returned. It was methodical, blunt, and immensely heavy. 3 slow strikes. A long, agonizing pause. 3 more strikes. The Elias cabin was situated at the end of a 4-mile dirt logging road near the dense, sprawling shores of Moosehead Lake. The nearest permanent neighbor was located across a frozen inlet, entirely inaccessible during the bitter winter storms that routinely buried the region. Sarah had traveled there alone to clear out the property, preparing the old structure for a long overdue family sale. The power had failed hours earlier beneath the weight of ice forming thick layers on the remote power lines, plunging the house into complete darkness. When the knocking first pulled her from sleep, her rational mind frantically searched for an explanation. She assumed it was a lost hunter, or perhaps a stranded motorist who had somehow managed to navigate the treacherous, unplowed logging road. But the wind outside was howling, driving sharp ice against the wooden siding of the house in a chaotic roar, while the knock remained distinct, unhurried, and perfectly timed. She wrapped a heavy woolen blanket tightly around her shoulders, picked up a heavy iron flashlight from her bedside table, and walked slowly down the narrow, creaking wooden staircase. The cabin was freezing, the internal temperature dropping rapidly without the hum of the electric furnace. The beam of her flashlight cut a pale, dusty yellow circle through the oppressive darkness of the living room, illuminating the worn rug and the stone fireplace. When she finally reached the sliding glass door at the back of the house, she fully expected to see a desperate face pressed against the frost, begging for shelter. Instead, there was only the black, mirrored reflection of the room behind her. She reached out and flipped the wall switch for the exterior floodlight, acting on pure, ingrained habit, fully aware the backup generator was not running. The knocking stopped the exact second her fingertips touched the cold plastic of the switch. Morning broke gray and blindingly cold, casting long skeletal shadows through the ancient pine trees that surrounded the property. Sarah, dressed in heavy layers, laced up her thick winter boots and walked the perimeter of the cabin to investigate. The snow was pristine, sparkling under the muted light, completely untouched by human boots or the heavy paws of a wandering bear. The area directly beneath the patio door was completely smooth, presenting a solid, unbroken sheet of white powder stretching out toward the dark tree line. There was absolutely no physical evidence that anyone or anything had stood on the wooden deck the night before. Desperate for comfort, she convinced herself it had been a heavy, frozen tree branch driven by the storm striking the glass in a strange, repetitive rhythm. She spent the rest of the short daylight hours chopping firewood, bringing the heavy logs inside, and securing the thick wooden storm shutters over all the ground floor windows. The second night thoroughly destroyed any comforting, rational theories she had built during the daylight hours. At exactly midnight, the knocking returned, but it was no longer testing the glass of the patio door. It began at the heavy oak front door of the cabin. The sound was incredibly blunt, echoing through the empty wooden entryway with a startling, violent volume. 3 heavy strikes, a long, agonizing pause of exactly 1 minute, 3 more strikes. Sarah sat on the top step of the second-floor landing, her heart hammering painfully against her ribs, her hands trembling as she clutched a heavy iron fire poker. She sat in absolute darkness, listening carefully as the source of the sound slowly began to move. It did not sound like footsteps moving across the wooden boards of the front porch. There was no familiar crunching of heavy boots in the deep snow, no creaking of the frozen wooden planks, no rustling of winter coats. There was only the dreadful, vast silence of the winter night, followed suddenly by 3 heavy strikes against the kitchen window on the eastern side of the house. 10 minutes later, the terrifying knocking shifted to the living room window on the western wall. Whatever was waiting outside was slowly circling the property, testing the perimeter, searching for a weakness in the walls. The strikes were so forceful that Sarah could hear the old window frames rattling violently in their wooden casements. She spent the remainder of the night huddled in the furthest corner of her bedroom, her back pressed hard against the cold plaster, watching the locked bedroom door until the sun finally began to rise at 6:30 in the morning. On the 3rd day, the paralyzing fear was replaced by a desperate need to escape. She packed a small canvas duffel bag, determined to drive the 4 miles down the logging road to the nearest paved highway, no matter how deep the snowdrifts had become. The outside temperature had plunged to 5 degrees below zero, freezing the moisture inside her nose with every breath. When she climbed into her pickup truck and turned the heavy metal key in the ignition, the engine did not turn over. There was no clicking of the starter, no struggling whine of the motor, no dimming of the dashboard lights. When she lifted the heavy steel hood of the truck, she found that the thick battery cables had been severed. It was not the jagged gnawing of a desperate, starving animal. The cuts were perfectly clean, sliced straight through the thick rubber and heavy copper wire with absolute precision. She was entirely isolated, stranded 40 miles from the nearest town. The third night brought a terrifying, impossible shift in the pattern. The knocking did not start at the doors or the windows. At exactly 11:15 p.m., the heavy, hollow sound came from directly above her head. Something was moving on the steep, slanted roof of the cabin. The heavy wooden support beams groaned under a sudden, immense, shifting weight, followed immediately by 3 hollow thuds against the frozen asphalt shingles. The terrible sound vibrated down through the wooden framework of the house, shaking decades of loose dust onto the bedroom floor. Sarah stared wide-eyed at the ceiling, paralyzed by the sheer physical impossibility of the situation. The roof of the cabin was pitched at a severe angle designed to shed heavy snowfall and was currently covered in 3 feet of slick, deadly ice. Nothing should have been able to stand up there, let alone strike the wood with such methodical, deliberate, and devastating force. The roof knocking continued for a full hour, dragging slowly from one end of the cabin to the other before sudden silence fell over the property. Sarah waited in the dark, her breath pluming in the freezing air of the bedroom, her grip tightening on the iron poker. Just as her exhausted muscles began to relax, the 3 strikes returned. This time, they came from deep beneath the wooden floorboards on the first floor. The cabin sat elevated on a shallow dirt crawlspace, barely high enough for an adult to drag themselves through on their stomach in total darkness. The sound was slightly muffled by the thick fiberglass insulation stuffed between the joists, but the rhythm remained entirely identical. 3 strikes. A 1-minute pause. 3 strikes. Something was positioned directly beneath the living room floor, knocking upward against the wood, tracking her movements through the ceiling. By the 4th day, severe sleep deprivation had begun to warp the edges of her reality. Shadows pooling in the corners of the empty rooms seemed to stretch, quiver, and linger just a moment too long when she moved her flashlight. The vast silence of the house was deafening, pressing heavily against her ears like deep water. She ventured outside for only 10 minutes to frantically gather the remaining firewood from the outdoor shed. It was during this panic trip that she noticed the perimeter of the house. There were still no footprints anywhere in the deep snow, but there was a continuous, shallow trench perfectly circling the cabin. It looked exactly as if a heavy, smooth, rounded object had been dragged slowly through the snow, maintaining an exact distance of 2 feet away from the exterior walls. The bizarre trench never deviated in its distance from the house, forming a perfect, unbroken circle around her prison. The 5th night marked the terrifying turning point in the ordeal. The massive winter storm outside had completely died down, leaving a still, crystalline cold in its wake. The silence of the forest was absolute, almost suffocating. At exactly 2 in the morning, the knocking began once again, but it severely lacked the muffled, hollow distance of the previous nights. The sound was sharp, incredibly resonant, and entirely too close. Sarah realized with a sickening, dizzying drop in her stomach that the knocking was coming from inside the walls of the house. It was echoing directly up from the darkness of the basement stairwell. She had securely locked the heavy basement door on the very first day, even taking the time to shove a heavy wooden dresser across the hallway to block the frame. Now, as she stood frozen in absolute terror at the top of the main staircase, she listened to the horrifying rhythm. 3 heavy thuds against the inner wood of the basement door. A 1-minute pause. 3 more thuds. Whatever had been circling the cabin in the snow, whatever had been dragging itself beneath the floorboards, was now standing on the wooden basement steps, violently knocking to get into the main hallway. Sarah backed away slowly, retreating silently up the stairs, never taking her wide eyes off the dark landing below. Once inside her bedroom, she locked the door, braced a wooden chair under the handle, and pushed her heavy oak bed frame across the floor to barricade herself in. On the 6th night, the patterned knocking escalated into a continuous, deafening assault that defied all reason. It began immediately at sundown and simply did not stop. It came from all sides of the house simultaneously. The heavy oak front door, the back wooden deck, the shuttered kitchen windows, the steep roof, and the barricaded basement door were all struck at once. The heavy, rhythmic thuds overlapped in the darkness, creating a maddening tribal drumbeat that literally shook the entire structure of the house. The framed family photographs lining the hallway vibrated right off their rusty nails, shattering violently on the hardwood floors. Sarah sat huddled tightly in the dead center of her bedroom floor, rocking back and forth with her hands pressed painfully hard over her ears. Desperate for anything else, she turned on a small battery-operated emergency radio, hoping to catch the local weather band, praying to hear a human voice. She rotated the small plastic dial with trembling fingers, pushing through thick walls of buzzing static. There were no voices, there was no music, there was no emergency broadcast, but as she tuned slowly past a dead frequency, the thick static suddenly dropped away into a low, droning electric hum. From the small, tinny speaker of the radio, she heard the sound. 3 heavy strikes. A pause. 3 heavy strikes. The radio was broadcasting the exact rhythm of the knocking that was currently tearing her house apart. It was as if the small device had tuned directly into the very frequency of the terror waiting outside. She violently crushed the plastic radio beneath the heel of her heavy winter boot, permanently silencing the speaker, but the overlapping knocking against the wooden walls continued unceasingly until the first pale light of dawn. The 7th night brought a completely different, infinitely worse kind of horror. There was no overlapping chaos, no deafening barrage against the exterior walls. Instead, there was an absolute, suffocating, breathless silence. Sarah waited in the freezing dark of her deeply barricaded bedroom, clutching a large steel hunting knife, her eyes wide and burning fiercely from exhaustion. The antique mechanical clock on the wall ticked loudly in the quiet room, counting down the dreadful minutes. Midnight passed without incident. 1 a.m. passed. 2 a.m. passed in total silence. She began to desperately hope that the terrible ordeal was finally over, that whatever had laid siege to the cabin had finally moved on into the deep, frozen woods. Then, at exactly 3:43 a.m., she heard it. The knocking did not come from the exterior walls of the house. It did not come from the steep roof or the dark basement. The 3 slow, methodical strikes came from the empty space of the wall directly behind her wooden headboard, the thin interior wall that separated her bedroom from the empty spare guest room. She slowly crawled backward away from the bed, moving silently toward the far corner of the room, her breathing shallow and ragged. Exactly 1 minute later, the knocking moved. It struck the heavy wooden panels of her own locked bedroom door from the hallway side. Then, incredibly, the sound moved entirely outside. It struck the exterior glass of her second-floor bedroom window, a window that was suspended exactly 30 feet in the air, featuring no balcony, no fire escape, and absolutely no tree branches anywhere nearby. After the 3 terrifying strikes on the second-story glass, the rhythm finally broke for the very first time. Instead of a 1-minute pause, a completely new sound began. A slow, agonizing, ear-piercing screech of heavy metal dragging against the frosty glass. It sounded exactly like a thick, rusted iron nail being slowly pulled across the fragile window pane, searching blindly for a seam, searching for a weakness in the wooden frame. The terrible scratching moved slowly from the top left corner of the window entirely down to the bottom right, sending a violent, sickening shiver straight down Sarah's spine. She crawled desperately into the small bedroom closet, pulled a pile of heavy winter coats completely over her head, squeezed her eyes shut in the absolute darkness, and waited in terror for the sound of shattering glass. 4 days later, a massive Yellow County snowplow finally managed to break through the towering snowdrifts, blocking the old logging road, clearing a passable path all the way to the Elias property. 2 local deputies followed closely behind in a 4-wheel drive vehicle, responding to a frantic, repeated welfare check requested by Sarah's worried family down in Boston. When the officers finally arrived, they found the isolated cabin half buried in fresh, sparkling snow. There was no smoke rising from the stone chimney. The heavy oak front door was entirely unlocked, swinging slightly inward with the bitter cold winter breeze. The deputies immediately drew their service weapons and stepped cautiously inside the freezing dark, loudly calling out her name. The cabin remained utterly, completely silent. The interior of the house was freezing, but perfectly, immaculately tidy. The kitchen counters were clean and wiped down, the living room furniture was undisturbed, the heavy wooden shutters were still tightly secured over all the ground floor windows. But when the two deputies slowly reached the back hallway, they found the heavy wooden dresser pushed violently aside. The thick door leading down to the dark basement was securely closed, but the wood itself was severely, unimaginably damaged. Hundreds of deep, jagged, overlapping indentations completely covered the surface of the wooden door, looking exactly as if someone had struck it repeatedly with terrifying strength using the rounded end of a heavy iron sledgehammer. The thick wood was splintered, cracked, and concaved inward, yet the heavy brass deadbolt remained perfectly locked from the outside. Sarah Elias was never found. The county police searched the surrounding winter woods for 2 solid weeks using highly trained tracking dogs, but the dogs completely refused to step past the initial tree line, simply sitting down in the deep snow and whining nervously at the dark, empty gaps between the towering pine trees. The official missing person report, formally filed on the 14th of November 1994, remains permanently open in the county archives, gathering dust in a filing cabinet. The Elias cabin stood completely empty for 20 long years before finally collapsing under the immense crushing weight of a severe winter storm. But the locals still strictly avoid the old logging road once the sun goes down. According to the older, superstitious residents of the town, if you park your car near the rotting ruins at exactly 2 in the morning and turn off your engine, you do not hear the wind blowing through the trees. You hear 3 hollow, rhythmic thuds echoing slowly and patiently from deep within the frozen black earth.